The Galactic Empire had rules. Lots of rules. Rules about trade routes and taxation. Rules about which species could own property on which planets. Rules about the acceptable decibel level of music played in spaceports after the third rotation cycle. They had a rule, I kid you not, about the minimum thread count of diplomatic robes. The Empire loved its rules the way a Vrelian mudslug loves moisture, completely, obsessively, and without any apparent awareness of how ridiculous it looked to everyone else. I am Queth Valos, Senior Observation Analyst for the Interstellar Neutral Bureau, and I have been documenting species interactions across 47 star systems for longer than most empires have existed. I have watched civilizations rise. I have watched them fall. I have watched one particularly unlucky species on a methane world invent agriculture and taxation on the same day, which I personally consider the cruelest joke the universe has ever told. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, in 412 years of field work, prepared me for what I witnessed in the Karata sector during what the humans call the Vorian Ultimatum Crisis. Let me set the scene for you. The Empire had been expanding in the Karata sector for roughly 60 standard years. Slow, methodical expansion, absorbing smaller systems, reclassifying indigenous species on a scale from fully sentient and taxable to marginally sentient and also taxable, because the Empire, if nothing else, was consistent in its motivations. The humans had been watching this expansion with the particular kind of quiet attention that had anyone in the Imperial Admiralty possessed functioning threat assessment instincts should have been deeply alarming. Humans do not make noise when they are angry. Other species do. The Thalvori screech. The Brenkai perform elaborate ritual displays of aggression that honestly look more like competitive dancing than actual threats. The Salvanari submit formal complaints in triplicate, which the Empire files directly into a recycling processor. But humans go quiet. They get still. And they start doing math. The Empire, regrettably, did not know this. What triggered the crisis was, depending on your perspective, either a catastrophic diplomatic miscalculation or the single most avoidable catastrophe in recorded galactic history. I personally vote for both. The Empire annexed the Pelori system, a small cluster of 4 inhabited worlds sitting at the outer boundary of what humans had, in their own quiet documentation, marked as their strategic buffer zone, not their territory, technically, not a formal alliance, just a line humans had drawn in their own records and never bothered to announce publicly, because from their perspective, announcing it would have been the same as admitting they thought someone might actually cross it. Someone crossed it. Governor Mereth Sullivan of the Imperial 7th Expansion Fleet did the crossing, with 43 warships, a full colonial administration corps, and absolutely zero awareness that he was about to become the most historically significant idiot in 3 centuries. He transmitted the standard Imperial Annexation Declaration to the Pelori Governing Council, gave them 36 hours to comply, and then, and this is the part that still makes me close my secondary eyes in disbelief, he sent a secondary message to the human diplomatic station in the sector, informing them, as a courtesy, that the buffer zone they had apparently established, quote, held no legal weight under Imperial Charter and would not be recognized. He told the humans their warning line did not count. Then he waited 36 hours for the Pelori to comply, received their compliance because the Pelori were 4 small worlds with no meaningful military capacity, and the survival instincts common to most species that have been around long enough to know when they are outgunned, and he filed his expansion report with Imperial Central Administration. Mission complete. Sector secured. Another 30 pages of rules added to the Imperial Charter covering Pelori taxation rates and diplomatic robe requirements. 48 hours after that, a single human vessel appeared at the edge of the Pelori system. Now, I should explain something about human vessels, because if you have only seen them in Imperial threat assessments, you are working with dangerously incomplete information. Imperial threat assessments describe human ships as mid-tier, adequate to good engine capability, reasonable weapons loadout, nothing exceptional. This is technically accurate, the same way describing a Varath pressure tiger as a medium-sized mammal with teeth is technically accurate. Correct on the surface, catastrophically misleading in practice. The vessel that appeared was a human diplomatic courier, small, visually unimpressive, the kind of ship the Empire categorized as non-combat class, and therefore not worth scrambling defensive systems over. It broadcast a standard hailing frequency and requested to speak with Governor Sullivan directly. Sullivan, to his credit, took the call. He was not worried. He had 43 warships. He had the full backing of Imperial Charter law. He had, presumably, a very nice diplomatic robe. The human on the other end of that transmission was a woman named Petra Ondash. And I want you to hold that name in your memory, because Petra Ondash is someone historians are going to be arguing about for the next several centuries. She was not the human head of state. She was not a military commander. She was, officially, a senior diplomatic liaison, which in human governmental structure sits somewhere in the middle of their bureaucratic hierarchy. The Empire's own protocol systems flagged her as a mid-level representative and categorized the incoming communication as a routine objection filing. Routine. I need you to appreciate that word. Routine. Petra Ondash looked at Governor Sullivan through the transmission screen, and she did not raise her voice. She did not deliver a speech. She did not list grievances or quote treaties or threaten anything specific. She simply said, in a tone I can only describe as the vocal equivalent of a door closing very quietly in a very large, very empty building. Governor Sullivan, I am authorized to inform you that the annexation of the Pelori system constitutes a crossing of a boundary that humanity established for the prevention of direct conflict. We issued this boundary as a courtesy. We are now issuing one formal warning. Withdraw from the Pelori system within 72 hours, and this matter will be addressed through diplomatic channels. Do not withdraw, and there will be no further communication before a response. Sullivan blinked. Is that a threat? Petra Ondash looked at him for a moment that lasted, by my recording, exactly 3 seconds. It is a warning, she said. We do not issue threats. Then she closed the transmission. I was monitoring this exchange from a neutral observation post approximately 2 light hours from the Pelori system, and I will tell you honestly, something shifted in my threat assessment cortex at that moment. Not because of what she said, because of what she did not say. Because of the complete and total absence of elaboration, justification, or emotional performance. The Empire's own diplomatic communications contain, on average, 412 words per formal statement. Petra Ondash used 61. Sullivan, predictably, did not withdraw. He filed a counter-communication with the human diplomatic station, explaining that Imperial Charter superseded unilateral boundary declarations, that the annexation was legal and final, and that he welcomed further diplomatic discussion through proper imperial channels. He also, and this is genuinely remarkable, sent a private note to his commanding admiral, describing the interaction as, quote, a minor territorial posturing from a species that has not yet learned how the game is played. The 72 hours passed. Nothing happened. On hour 73, Sullivan sent a brief transmission to Imperial Central, noting that the human warning had apparently been a bluff, and that the Karata sector expansion could continue as planned. His fleet began preliminary surveys of the next target system. His Colonial Administration Corps started unpacking in the Pelori system. His tactical officers downgraded the human diplomatic station from watch status to routine monitoring. At hour 74, 17 human warships came out of faster-than-light transit simultaneously at 7 different points around the Pelori system. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters here. Not 17 ships at one point spread out, the way most species deploy a show of force, visually dramatic, tactically dispersed, designed to look threatening while actually concentrating your firepower disadvantageously. 17 ships at 7 different points, calculated entry vectors, every single one of them positioned to cover a specific Imperial ship's potential retreat corridor. Sullivan's fleet had 43 ships. He outnumbered the humans more than 2 to 1. His tactical officers ran the combat probability assessments, looked at the human positioning, and then ran them again, because the first results seemed like a malfunction. Then one of his senior officers, a Bren Kai commander named Veth Osari, who had, it turned out, actually read the available non-imperial data on human combat doctrine, walked up to Sullivan's command station and said, very quietly, "Governor, those positioning vectors are not for attack. They are to prevent us from leaving." The room went silent. Sullivan stared at the tactical display. His fleet outnumbered them. His ships were larger, in aggregate, with more total weapons tonnage, but the humans had not come in fighting. They had come in cornering, Every escape vector for every one of his 43 ships was covered by a human vessel positioned at the exact optimal intercept point. It was not a battle formation. It was a trap that had been sprung so quietly, so cleanly, that no one in his fleet had realized it was happening until it was already done. Then a second transmission came from Petra Ondash. She looked exactly the same as she had 74 hours earlier. Same posture, same expression, same tone that made the entire room feel like a pressure differential had just shifted somewhere. "Governor Sullivan," she said, "the warning period has elapsed. You have one additional opportunity to begin withdrawal. I will wait while you consider your response." And she sat there, on the screen, and waited. Someone on Sullivan's bridge coughed. Sullivan did not respond immediately. This was, by the standards of Imperial protocol, actually quite reasonable. Major military decisions were supposed to involve consultation, documentation, committee review, and at least 2 separate legal sign-offs from Imperial charter specialists. By the standards of the specific situation he was currently in, however, it looked exactly like what it was, which was a man trying very hard not to show that his hands were shaking. His tactical officers were whispering. His communications staff was pulling every available file on human military engagements, which turned out to be, once you filtered out the sanitized Imperial summaries, considerably more comprehensive and considerably more alarming than anyone on that bridge had previously understood. Vithosari, the Brenkai commander who had correctly identified the trap, was standing very still in the way that prey animals stand still when they have assessed a predator, and concluded that movement is inadvisable. Petra Ondash sat on the screen and waited. "I have reviewed this transmission recording many times since the incident. What strikes me, every single time, is that she did not tap her fingers. She did not check anything off-screen. She did not perform patience the way most species perform it, with visible effort and the occasional significant exhale. She simply existed in that moment with the total stillness of someone who had already completed every calculation worth completing, and was now merely waiting for external events to catch up with internal conclusions. 4 minutes and 17 seconds passed. Sullivan straightened in his command chair, pulled his diplomatic robe into correct positioning, and said, with the specific tone of a man who has decided that dignity is the only currency he has left, "Liaison Ondash, I am prepared to discuss the terms of a temporary withdrawal pending full Imperial legal review of the boundary dispute." Petra Ondash nodded once. "Withdrawal first," she said. "Discussion after. That is not standard diplomatic sequencing." "No," she agreed pleasantly, "it is not." Another silence. "How long do I have to begin withdrawal?" Sullivan asked. "You have already begun," Petra said. "Or you have not. Those are the available options." Sullivan began withdrawal. All 43 ships, coordinated and documented, pulling back from the Pelori system in good order, while 17 human vessels maintained their intercept positions with the patience of people who had packed sufficient supplies for multiple outcomes, and were entirely comfortable with whichever one materialized. The Colonial Administration Corps repacked. The survey teams stood down. The preliminary expansion files for the next target system were, I can only imagine, quietly shelved somewhere in the Fleet Administrative Archive where no one would have to look at them for a while. When the last Imperial ship cleared the Pelori boundary, the human vessels did not cheer. They did not broadcast anything. 11 of the 17 simply transited back out of the system in the same quiet, coordinated way they had arrived. The remaining 6 took up a loose patrol pattern around the Pelori system and stayed there. That was it. No battle. No casualties. No debris field. The kind of ending that, if you described it to someone who had not witnessed the middle section, would sound almost disappointingly undramatic. Oh, some ships showed up, and some other ships left. Sure. Fine. Except the ships that left were 43 vessels belonging to the 7th expansion fleet of an empire that had absorbed 61 systems in 60 years, and had never, not once, reversed an annexation because someone asked them to. I filed my observation report that evening, and added 6 new categories to my species assessment documentation for humanity, 3 of which I had never needed to use before in 412 years of field work. Now, here is where the story becomes considerably more complicated, because the empire was embarrassed, and embarrassed empires are specifically the category of political entity most likely to make the kind of decisions that give neutral observers existential anxiety. Imperial Central Administration received Solvan's withdrawal report, convened an emergency session of the Expansion Oversight Council, and spent approximately 48 hours arguing about what had actually happened and who was technically responsible for it. Solvan submitted his account. Vethosari submitted a separate account that contained considerably more tactical detail and considerably less self-exculpatory framing. The Imperial Legal Division submitted a 1,400-page analysis of whether humanity's boundary declaration had any standing under charter law, concluded that it did not, and somehow managed to make this conclusion sound like a victory despite the fact that the fleet had retreated anyway. The decision that emerged from this process was, and I say this as a professional observer who has documented the decision-making processes of 231 distinct civilizations, one of the most impressively wrong-headed responses to a diplomatic situation I have ever recorded. Imperial Admiral Tavrak Hassoun, who had not been present at the Pelori system, had not spoken with Petra Ondash, and had apparently reviewed the incident primarily through the lens of the Legal Division's 1,400-page document rather than through any of the tactical reports, decided that the correct response was to demonstrate Imperial resolve by sending a larger fleet to complete the Pelori annexation. 112 vessels. The full Second Expansion Armada. Enough firepower to, in his personal written assessment, make the human response both militarily and politically untenable. I read that assessment. I read it 3 times. I kept waiting for the part where someone in the room said, out loud, that the humans had just maneuvered 43 ships into full containment with 17, and perhaps sending 112 was not a mathematical solution, so much as a mathematical escalation, but that part never came. Apparently the meeting room lacked a Vethosari. The Second Expansion Armada transited into the Karada sector 8 days later. They found 41 human vessels already waiting in the Pelori system, again at calculated intercept positions, and a message from Petra Ondash, and I cannot overstate how much I respect this detail, that had been recorded and transmitted 11 hours before the Imperial fleet arrived, because the humans had predicted the response timeline accurately enough to send the reply before the provocation completed its journey. The message said, and I am going to quote it in full because brevity deserves respect. Admiral Hassoun, we issued one warning. It was delivered, received, and acted upon. We issued no second warning because we do not issue second warnings. Your fleet's presence in the Karada sector at these coordinates represents the beginning of a response, not an opportunity for further discussion. You may still withdraw. We recommend it. Hassoun did not withdraw. He opened a combat channel, began a formal engagement declaration under Imperial Military Code, and ordered his fleet into attack formation. The humans did not move. Every single human vessel stayed exactly where it was and let the Imperial formation close to engagement range. Hassoun's tactical officers, running their assessments, flagged this as either an error, a malfunction, or something else that their assessment software apparently did not have a category for. 112 ships against 41. The numbers were overwhelming. The Imperial fleet had the range advantage, the firepower advantage, the numerical advantage. By every standard metric, the human response was tactically insane. Then a third of Hassoun's fleet discovered, simultaneously, that their navigation systems had been broadcasting position data on an unsecured frequency for the past 11 hours. Not hacked, not corrupted. Broadcasting, in the specific technical sense of transmitting information that something else had been quietly listening to and building a very precise, very current, very comprehensive picture of exactly where every Imperial ship was, where it was going, how fast it could accelerate, and which of its neighbors it would collide with if it needed to perform an emergency evasion maneuver. The humans had spent 11 hours doing math. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. No Imperial ship was destroyed. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to understanding what actually happened. The humans did not blow up 112 ships. They disabled them. Engines, weapon systems, communications arrays, targeted, precise, sequential, not a blunt instrument, a surgical one. By the time the 9th minute concluded, 47 Imperial vessels were drifting without propulsion, 31 had lost weapons capability, but retained movement, and the remaining 34 had intact systems, but were positioned in a configuration from which any movement would result in collision with their own disabled fleetmates. Hassoun's flagship was in the second category. He could move, he could not fight. He was surrounded by his own broken fleet, like a person who has knocked over every piece of furniture in a room trying to reach the door. Petra Ondash's transmission came through on his command screen, 11 seconds after the last Imperial weapons system went offline. She looked, I want to note, exactly the same as she had looked in every previous transmission. Same posture, same expression. The universe had just watched 41 ships systematically dismantle 112 in 9 minutes, and she had the specific energy of someone who had expected this outcome so completely that its arrival required no visible reaction. "Admiral Hassoun," she said, "we will provide navigational assistance to any vessel that requires help clearing the system. Medical teams are available if needed. Your crews will not be harmed. Please broadcast your acceptance of assistance on the standard emergency frequency when you are ready." Hassoun stared at his tactical display for a long time. Then he broadcast on the emergency frequency. It took 3 days to clear the debris field and get the Imperial fleet mobile enough to withdraw. Human repair and medical teams boarded damaged vessels, fixed what was immediately dangerous, and left everything else in a state of functional but humbled. They were, by all accounts, from Imperial crew members who later filed incident reports, professionally courteous, technically precise, and mildly unsettling in the specific way that people are unsettling when they are being genuinely helpful in a situation where you expected them to be angry. One Imperial ensign, a young Thalvori named Sevrithal, who wrote a personal account that later circulated widely across the Empire's civilian networks, described the human technician who repaired his station's life support array as efficient, pleasant, and the most frightening person I have ever met, despite the fact that he spent most of the time telling me about a food dish his grandmother used to make. That account got shared approximately 400 million times across Imperial civilian networks in the following month, which tells you something about the mood inside the Empire once the full story became public. The political aftermath was considerable. Sullivan was reassigned to an administrative post on a station so remote it appeared on exactly one navigational chart. Hassoun retired early, citing health considerations, which was the kind of thing that technically could mean anything, and practically meant something very specific. The Imperial Expansion Oversight Council commissioned a full review of human military capability assessments, which I understand produced a document that was classified at the highest security level immediately upon completion, which meant that the people most likely to make future decisions about humanity were precisely the people least likely to have read it. The Pylori system was, quietly and without formal announcement, removed from Imperial expansion planning indefinitely, and Petra Ondash went back to her regular duties as senior diplomatic liaison, filed her incident report in the standard format, and, as far as anyone in the neutral observation community could determine, went home and had dinner. I submitted my final report on the Vorian ultimatum crisis to the Interstellar Neutral Bureau with a supplementary recommendation that every intelligence division in every member civilization update their human assessment files immediately and substantially. I included Ensign Sevrithal's account as an appendix, because sometimes the most accurate analysis comes from the person who was just trying to breathe recycled air and ended up in the middle of history. The thing that the Empire never quite understood, the thing that I think most species do not understand until they have watched humanity operate in a genuine crisis, is that the warning was never a bluff, it was never posturing, it was never the opening move in a negotiation or a performance designed to create leverage. When Petra Ondash said they issued one warning, she was being completely, literally, precisely accurate in the way that only people with absolute confidence in what comes after the warning can afford to be. The Empire had rules about everything. Humanity had something different. Humanity had already done the math, already run the scenarios, already positioned the pieces, and then offered you once the opportunity to walk away before the game concluded. They should have listened. Most species, given several centuries and a sufficiently dramatic example, eventually learned to listen. The Empire learned on the slow end of the scale, but it learned. I have that on record.